Hello, this is another recording for the Suffolk Jungian Circle. Our October meeting, we are going to be discussing Jung and the realm of parapsychology. So this is just a bit of an overview of that to get conversation going, and as with every other one of these recordings, it's also there for anybody else who might be remotely interested in listening. And if you would like the link to the online meeting, which is the last Wednesday evening of the month, then do give me a shout and I will email you the link. So there's a lot that could be said on parapsychology, but I'm going to make a conscious effort to keep it short. Partly because there's a very good website which goes into a lot of detail on the various parapsychological, shall we say, mystical experiences that Jung had in his lifetime, and also things had by his various family members and relatives, the ones that are known of at any rate. So rather than me trying to recount every single one of them, would be here forever, just to give you a bit of an overview of some of those events and how they key into Jung's ideas. I think that might be more useful than just a big long list of strange and mysterious events that happened and sort of informed him. Suffice to say that although he came from a very Christian family with lots of ministers and clergymen and so on, many of them had quite what we would call paranormal beliefs in various things. I was going to say things like life after death, because that is a standard belief in Christianity. But where it starts to become paranormal is in the notion of the dead returning, because within more standard Christian teachings, the dead are in the sort of heavenly realms in the mind of God, as it were. They're not flitting back and forth to the land of the living to say hello to people. So that's where it kind of deviates from standard Christian teaching into something of a more paranormal, parapsychological kind of format. So there were various relatives he had who were in contact, or shall we say, believed they were, if you're a bit of a skeptic, believed they were in contact with deceased relatives, would have visitations from these deceased relatives. So Jung was growing up in the kind of family where those sorts of events had happened and were perhaps discussed about in family meetings and that sort of thing, people reminiscing about assaulted relatives and what they'd been through, but not just kind of from multiple generations earlier. Jung's own mother was inclined towards spiritism and sort of clairvoyant experiences and activities, and he talks about her as having a dual personality. That there was the sort of mumsy version of her during the daytime that he loved and was very familiar with as a child, and kind of still, I suppose, related to even as he got older. And then there was the mystical version of her, which tended to come to the fore more at night, where she would go off and do things, presumably after she'd put the kids to bed. But maybe some of them were earwigging at the door, or creeping down the staircase to listen to what was going on with the adults, and becoming aware of some of these strange goings on. And he talks about her having this voice. Now, whether you take that in the sense of her maybe channeling a spirit guide or something like that, or simply when she was off in trance, it's not uncommon for people in trance to talk in a slightly different way from their normal manner of communication. Often their voices slow down, become sometimes a deeper voices, that sort of thing. So there was the trance voice and the trance personality, and then there was the day-to-day motherly version of Jung's mother. And this continued on into his adulthood, so not just memories of when he was a little boy, but experiences of his mother when he was a grown man. And he later says he also has this kind of duality within him. There's the day-to-day Carl Jung, and there is this other him that comes out when he's having mystical experiences. And I think that dualism does reflect a lot into Jung's psychology. And you could argue that growing up with this idea of people having dual personalities then leads him to think more and more in terms of dualities. For example, the thinking and feeling personality types, the sensation and the intuition personality types, anima and animus, shadow and hero. there's all these dualisms going on in Jungian thought, and some of it I feel sure tracks back to this experience, both of his own internalized dualism, but also the dualism of his mother, and maybe hearing stories about older relatives who had these kind of dualistic states of mind where they would slip in and out. And the fact that a key element of that dualism is the mystical, the paranormal. Lots of people, you could say, have dualistic personalities in other ways. I dare say we've all probably met at least one person, if not several, who may be perfectly pleasant when out in public, but you discover that behind locked doors, at home, they're knocking seven shades out of their spouse and children and turning into absolute tyrants and monsters. And there is a sort of Jekyll and Hyde thing going on there. So there's that kind of dualism, but that's not really what interests Jung. Maybe if he had grown up in a family with some relative who was nice by day and a complete psychopath by night, he would have been more interested in that flavour of dualism. But it's the shifting between a kind of grounded reality-based self and a more supernatural, mystical self, um, perhaps inspiring the idea of people being able to channel archetypes, potentially, if it gets out of hand, becoming inflated by the presence of an archetype taking over their everyday personality and overwhelming their sense of humanity in a way. That I think is really what is driving a lot of Jung's ideas and notions. And he also writes at length about his cousin Helene, who was a professional medium. People would come to her for seances and things like that. And Jung, when he was older, studied his cousin and sat with her when she was doing her seances. Well, some of them at any rate, doing the seances, and kind of noted what was happening and the events that would take place and the movement into different personalities and so on. So this continues to be a fascination for him. And there's another dualism going on here, which we have spoken about quite often in our online meetings, that as he's becoming an adult and he's obviously into professional life, he is clearly very aware that the professional community that he is a member of will laugh him out of business if he is seen to advocate for things that they regard as nonsense. So whilst he is fascinated by those very subjects, sort of telekinesis and telepathy and psychokinesis and tarot cards and the I Ching and all these sorts of things, he's also acutely aware that the wider scientific community in which he moves and the medical community in which he moves and is to a large extent reliant upon for his professional life, they mostly regard these things as absolute twaddle. And so he's treading this very careful line where one bit of him is fascinated by those subjects, and the other bit of him realises he cannot be seen to give credence or to condone or to encourage or validate those experiences. At least if he does, he will lose his professional credibility. And so the way he is phrasing things, it's often in the line of, here's my cousin, my patient, my whoever it happens to be on the particular occasion he's writing about, who has these weird experiences, but they can be accounted for in a more rationalistic approach by saying that these alternate voices and personalities and spirits that are coming through are not real spirits, they're not objective realities, they are what eventually John Rowan would go on to call sub-personalities. They are aspects of the individual that are sort of sharded off into these pocket selves, which sometimes speak through the person when they enter a trance state and their main kind of ego consciousness turns off, or gets parked in a corner at any rate, and this other self comes forward. So he's almost reminds me a little bit of a Scooby-Doo episode where you've got the ghost or the zombie or the werewolf or whatever it is, and then they rip the mask off at the end and go, aha, it's the caretaker. And there is a rational explanation for something that seems to be mystical and by the values of the more rationalist professional bodies around him mumbo jumbo. So he's kind of treading a fine line, of flitting between the two. And one of the dualities he talks around, but doesn't really go into huge amounts of detail on. Not the way to the extent that he does with, say, shadow and hero and anima animus and all the things like that. Is this line between, or dualism, I should say, rather, that wrong direction, dualism, between the rational self, the logical, rational, intellectual self, and the functions of the intellect, and the functions of what he often refers to as superstition, the mystical, the highly intuitive, the paranormal part of the self. But even though he's trying to tread this fine line, he's saying that these, like all of his other dualisms, these are basically two sides of a single coin. That even though they may seem poles apart and in opposition to one another, actually they are interrelated, and like the Tao symbol in Taoism, they are kind of interlocked eternally. You cannot have the rational without the superstitious, or vice versa. You always have the two. Even though he's kind of going down that line of argument, there is a bit of him that is clearly giving, in his written works, a lot of credence to the strange phenomena that he is studying. He talks about a meeting he had with Freud, who was hugely sceptical. Freud was convinced it was all an absolute load of old cobblers. One of the phrases that Freud uses at one stage is the mud of occultism, is kind of all this sort of, it's all sludge and nonsense and not worth bothering with. And there's Jung going on and on and on about it, and Freud is clearly tutting and rolling his eyeballs as Jung is going on about it. They had a meeting with Freud, and they were talking about various issues, and it's fairly obvious that there is a bit of a tension going on in this conversation. And there's these weird noises, these bangs and thumps and crashes and whatnot, emanating from a bookshelf. And it's never explained in the written bit what on earth is causing it. In fact, it's kind of implied that the causation is something paranormal. It's not, one of the servants thumping about with a duster next door or something like that. It is something metaphysical, which Jung is seeing as a direct correlation to the kind of tense conversation he's having with Freud about paranormal phenomena. And the more Freud scoffs at it, the kind of louder the rattling becomes from the bookshelf, which Jung is not saying is spirits appearing from the ether to rattle the books on the bookshelf. Rather, he's implying it's either something within his own psyche, or possibly it's something within Freud's psyche, but it's an exteriorization of internal tensions, that the mind generates this energy and it goes somewhere, and sometimes where it goes is to move objects or to rattle books or whatever it was precisely doing on this bookshelf to cause the noises. It has ripples out into the physical world. So he's still like a lot of current day parapsychologists who explore things like telekinesis and telepathy and psychokinesis and all the rest of it. He is looking for a causation of these phenomena which tracks back to the individual human mind. So it's not a ghost from the land of the dead that's causing things to rattle. It is as with the explanations of poltergeist activity, it's often assumed, or various researchers identified as centering around a teenager. Well, usually, I'm dare say there must be other cases where it's older age groups, but usually a teenager. And the implication is that the teenager is giving off some kind of excitable psychic energy, which is causing objects to whiz about the room and do all sorts of strange things. So it's not a demon, it's not a ghost, it's not fairies at the bottom of the garden. It is something to do with the human in the room that is causing these things to happen. And Jung is usually focusing on that sort of an explanation for the weird stuff he is seeing going on, and both in his own life and in the accounts given to him by patients that he's treating, and accounts of relatives that may be long since dead by the time he's writing down their stories. That there is a human explanation, but not a rationalist one, in that someone is maliciously pushing objects around to trick people, rather that they are releasing internalized forces which they themselves don't understand, which are having an impact on the world around them and maybe freaking them the hell out because they don't realize that these things are ultimately emanating from within themselves. So there's these kind of understandings going on there. He mentions having various precognitive premonitions, episodes, where he sees things that will then come to pass, or at least are emblematic, symbolic of things that will come to pass, like a great tide of blood, which was an experience he had, as kind of a vision he had just prior to the kick-off of World War One. And allegedly before he died in 1961, he also had weird visions then and recorded them, but they're not, so far as I know, I don't think they are publicly available for anyone to know what they were. But they're a bit doomy and gloomy, apparently. So it wasn't visions of lovely, happy, skipping through the daisies type stuff. It was visions of various dark, terrible things happening. So it's, I suppose, a bit unfortunate that a lot of premonitions tend to be of terrible things rather than premonitions of lovely things going on. But what he is suggesting around there is that there are ripples that move through the collective unconsciousness of things that are stirring, moving. Time is possibly a factor here, in that there are references to time being not entirely linear, so that things that to me right now, right this minute, haven't happened yet, stuff that will happen in a week, a month, a year, a decade, at some level, at least some of those events arguably have kind of happened, and they can ripple backwards so that I can get a sense now, through a dream or a vision or whatever it may be, of something that feels very futuristic to me, but in some sense has kind of already happened, or at least a bit like, I suppose, flicking when they do those domino things where they put all the hundreds of dominoes in a line and weird shapes and things, and they flick one over and they go boom, 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 that you can kind of predict where the dominoes will go in 30 seconds from now, because you can see the patterns forming. But someone who couldn't see the patterns forming might go, oh my god, how did you know that domino would right over there would fall over? So in a sense, perhaps the collective unconscious is a sensation of things that are happening, some of them right now, or perhaps have very recently happened, to the human collective. So it may not have happened in your personal life, you may not have direct knowledge of it, but you can have indirect knowledge of it through the collective unconscious. And maybe it could be argued that if you've got a good kind of mind, the intuitive function to leap from A to Z and skip B, C, D, E, F, etc. on the way, because your mind can see at a tremendous speed where things will come out, you might say, well, 6 months from now, a year from now, this thing will happen, and it does, because you've seen the interconnection of the dominoes falling, as it were. Even if nobody else can see the dominoes falling, but you have. And so you skip to the end result, the final domino, and announce that, and it feels like a prophecy. That's kind of I think, where he's coming from in some of his arguments, in terms of some of his understandings, that there's these abilities to see where things are going and to understand, and so time is not necessarily quite as linear as we think of it as being, or we experience it as being, at any rate. So a bit of a sort of a fluid pattern going on there in various different ways. So it opens up interesting possibilities. He talks as well about synchronicity, which we have talked about. I can't remember when, I think a year or more ago now. We had synchronicity as a discussion topic for one of our monthly meetings. And he gives examples, things to do with scarabs and kingfishers and various other things, having weird dreams and sensations that were linked to the suicide of a patient. All sorts of stuff like that, where something has gone on at one level and then there's been a physical manifestation of it at another level. And again, suggesting that there's all these sort of dualisms which impinge partly on the personal unconscious of the individual, but also the collective unconscious of where we patch into each other. And we can pick up on each other. So person A can feel the pain and suffering of person B, or I suppose feel the happiness and joy of person B for that matter, without any direct connection to them in the sense of there's been no phone call, no letter, no email, no nothing to tell you what's going on in person B's life. You just kind of pick up on the psychic ripples, as it were, coming through the collective unconscious. So there's ways of sort of understanding what is going on that might well be labelled parapsychological, in that it can be very hard to explain in terms of current level scientific explanations, and often it is this kind of element which others have commented on, that the science of today was the magic of yesterday. That things that seemed amazing and astounding to people hundreds of years ago we can now explain in various ways, and by implication, of course, stuff that seems amazing and wonderful and mysterious to us today, jump forward 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, people might be able to explain, might be able to control and manipulate because they've developed technology to do so. So it's being aware that parapsychology can include phenomena, I suppose like telepathy would be a fairly good explanation, which we might struggle to explain the mechanisms of today from a purely rationalistic science point of view. But going again with this superstition, rationalism, dualism, a lot of isms, at some point in the future may be quite explicable, and indeed explicable to the point where people can be trained in how to do it. And what seems mystical and magical today may seem rational in the future, because that will have the explanation. It's only mystical because we don't have the explanation for it. So I suppose maybe it's a dualism is between the inexplicable and the explicable. And what is inexplicable to one group or one century may be explicable for another group or another century. And that's a kind of a dualism in and of itself, as they all sort of interlink in various different ways. Oh yes, the other element that I think is perhaps worth mentioning, although maybe this could be a discussion in and of itself as a separate thing entirely, but I've already mentioned the idea of inflation, of being possessed by an archetype. He also talks about things like soul loss and soul possession, which he associates with complexes, mental constellations of ideas and habits and attitudes and emotional kind of components that constellate to create a pattern. And these patterns are attached to us at various levels, and ego attachments and collective unconscious attachments and so on. So different kind of tiers of consciousness where the complex may come into it. For soul loss, it's when people start to, well, kind of pretty much what it says on the tin really, lose contact with certain complexes, certain aspects of themselves that lead to a feeling of emptiness and hollowness, that there is something profound gone from them. And within some shamanic practices, there is this notion of soul retrieval, that the soul can be broken up by various traumatic events and bits of it lost, and that the shaman, who is a kind of could be regarded as a precursor, cultural precursor of the kind of psychotherapist, perhaps in some, except with rattles and feathers, engaging in not dissimilar activities, can go on a journey and help to retrieve the missing bits of the person and bring them back together where they can reintegrate. I suppose a key difference is that the 21st century approach in psychotherapy at any rate would be to try and get the person to reintegrate themselves, with the therapist acting as a guide, rather than this more shamanic idea that the client sits in a corner having a cup of tea and a fag, whilst the shaman goes into a deep trance and they do all the legwork of finding these missed bits of the self and bringing them back for the client. I think perhaps either approach would work. Horses for courses, maybe, according to what people like or don't like. But the bringing together of self and possession, inflation, is where a complex so overwhelms the psyche, so overwhelms the personality, that it drowns out any sense of individuality, and the person becomes this kind of fixated, almost like they're stuck in a groove, stuck in a rut, doing the same thing again and again and again, going round and round and round this complex, this pattern of unhealthy thinking, unhealthy behaviour, losing sight of their own complexity, losing sight of the fact that there is other bits to them, and interests and hobbies and likes and dislikes and memories and all the rest of it. The more dominant the complex becomes, the more simplistic their personality becomes a one-note caricature, as the more kind of extended bits of themselves get lost sight of, and it takes possession and it's dominant. Again, he's not suggesting that these are actual spirits in the way that many ancient cultures definitely would have considered, and well, not just ancient cultures, current day cultures definitely would consider this to be some kind of malevolent spirit taking over a person, and that through exorcisms and various other kinds of rituals and interventions, that malevolent spirit can be cast out. Rather, Jung, this could be him hedging his scientific bets to stay on the right side of his community, or it may be a very genuine belief on his part that this is precisely what it is. Regards this as a kind of sub-personality that has overwhelmed the major personality. So it's one bit of a person that's taken over all the rest of the bits of a person. It's not an externalized force, a creature of the underworld in the actual sense of the term. Rather, it's a normally minor repressed part of themselves, perhaps an unconscious part of themselves, that has rushed in and taken over the centre stage and becomes so domineering that nothing else within that person gets a look in, at least until some kind of intervention is performed to cast out, or maybe we could say reintegrate in a healthier way, that complex, to prevent it from domineering and subsuming the entire psyche and the entire personality. And that could be seen as a kind of a parapsychological experience, spirit possession and spirit loss, and the various kind of pathologies that can develop within the individual. I suppose it's down to the individual person, and we could talk about this in the group, whether you feel that all of this is always internalized. It's always just a bit of me taking over the rest of me kind of thing. Or is it actually possible, as many religions claim, that there are forces beyond us, external forces, maybe discarnate spirits, maybe some malevolent other person who has an ability to disrupt the minds and souls of the people they don't like for whatever reason they don't like them. Can it be understood as an externalized force, or must it always be understood for the sake of rationalism as an internalized force within the individual that is causing disharmony and disruption? Um, I'm open to discussion on that one, but my own inclination is to say sometimes one and sometimes the other, in that I don't dismiss the existence of presences in the universe. I don't think everything boils down to our own psyche and nothing but our own psyche. But quite aware that some people would. Some people think the whole kind of spirits and ghosties and ghoulies and whatnot is all so much Coppola's poetic whimsy, perhaps is a better way of putting it, and that everything ultimately is an internalized force rather than an external force that comes from somewhere else to take over the psyche. But I wanted to keep this short, and I don't really do short, do I? So short as I'm likely to get, so I'll leave it there, and we can talk about these ideas in the meeting at the end of the month. And as I said at the start, if you haven't participated in these monthly discussions and would like to, it's all done on Teams, so I'm quite happy to send you the link and you can tune in. I know it's called the Suffolk Circle, but not everyone is actually resident in Suffolk. So we do get people who live in darkest Essex and places like that who take part. So I don't see any reason why people from further afield couldn't take part if they would like to. Yeah, take care. Thank you.